The day had started like any other for Kevin and his son, Marcus. Kevin had promised his son that he would take him to the doctor to get a checkup, something Marcus had been needing for a while. Marcus wasn't feeling well for a few days, and his father, being the caring parent that he was, wanted to make sure that his son would get the best treatment. They arrived at the clinic, a small, quiet building tucked away on a calm street. The waiting room was filled with a few other people, some reading magazines, and others quietly talking. The air smelled like disinfectant, the scent that always made Kevin think of doctors. Marcus, on the other hand, fidgeted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He hadn't been feeling like himself for days, and it seemed to make him anxious. "Dad, do you think I'm really sick?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with worry. Kevin looked at his son, trying to calm him. "Don't worry, buddy. We're just here to make sure everything's okay. You'll feel better soon," Kevin reassured him, offering a small smile. As they waited, the door to the doctor's office opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wore a white coat, his name tag reading Dr. Howard. Kevin stood up, nodding politely at the doctor. Dr. Howard gave a quick glance at Marcus and then turned his attention back to Kevin. "Mr. Anderson, right?" Dr. Howard asked, his tone casual but distant. "Come on in." Kevin followed the doctor into the examination room, and Marcus trailed behind. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and was filled with medical instruments neatly arranged on shelves. Marcus climbed onto the examination table, his legs swinging nervously. Dr. Howard didn't seem to notice how uncomfortable Marcus was. He barely looked at the boy before quickly flipping through some notes on his clipboard. "So, Marcus here has been feeling unwell for a few days?" Dr. Howard asked, barely glancing up. Kevin nodded, his concern growing. "Yes, he has been complaining of stomach pain, and he's been feeling tired. He hasn't been eating well either," Kevin explained, his voice tense. "I think something's wrong." Dr. Howard looked at Marcus for a moment, then waved a hand dismissively. "It's probably just a little stomach bug. Kids get them all the time. Nothing serious," he said, as though it was no big deal. Kevin frowned. "But he's not getting better. I think we need to run some tests." Dr. Howard raised an eyebrow, his expression cold. "Tests? For something so minor? Trust me, he'll be fine in a day or two. Just give him some rest and fluids. There's no need to make a fuss." Kevin felt his frustration rising. "I don't think you understand. He's really not doing well. Please, can we just run a few tests to make sure?" he insisted. Dr. Howard stood up, his posture stiff. "You're overreacting. I don't see any reason for tests. Let's not waste any more time." Kevin's heart pounded in his chest. His son was clearly in discomfort, and yet this doctor seemed uninterested, even dismissive. Kevin knew something wasn't right. He wasn't about to let the doctor brush off his son's health, not when he felt so strongly that Marcus needed more than just a casual look over. Kevin sat back in his chair, watching Dr. Howard carefully. He could feel a knot in his stomach tighten as the doctor started scribbling on his clipboard, clearly ignoring the concern Kevin had just expressed. It wasn't just the dismissive attitude. Something about the way the doctor spoke, the way he looked at Marcus, made Kevin uncomfortable. The doctor didn't even seem to care about Marcus' pain. Kevin tried again. "I understand you think it's nothing serious, but Marcus has been really weak. He's not himself. It's more than just a little stomach bug," Kevin said, his voice becoming firmer. Dr. Howard glanced at Marcus, then back at Kevin, his eyes cold. "You're overreacting. Kids get tired. They get stomach pains. It's normal," he said, his tone flat, as if he had dealt with parents like Kevin many times before. "A simple rest and some medicine. That's all he needs." Marcus, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't feel good, Dad. My stomach really hurts." Kevin felt his heart break for his son. Marcus' voice was weak, and his face had an ashen look to it. It wasn't just a stomach ache, Kevin could tell something was wrong. He could see that Marcus was in pain, yet the doctor wasn't listening. But it wasn't just the way the doctor dismissed his son's illness. Kevin noticed something else, something he hadn't caught at first. When Dr. Howard looked at Marcus, there was a certain coldness in his eyes, a look that made Kevin's stomach churn. It was as if the doctor didn't want to help simply because of who Marcus was. Kevin had heard stories about prejudice in medicine, but he hadn't expected to experience it himself, especially not in a place where his son's health should have been the main concern. Kevin tried to push aside his growing suspicion, but it was becoming harder to ignore. Dr. Howard turned to Kevin. "I don't see a need to waste any more time. We'll just give him some fluids and let him rest. If he's still complaining tomorrow, maybe we can talk again. But for now, it's nothing serious," the doctor said, clearly eager to end the appointment. Kevin's patience was wearing thin. "I'm not leaving until I get answers. I'm not going to just go home and wait for him to get worse." Dr. Howard's eyes narrowed. "You need to trust me. I'm the doctor here, and I know what's best for your son." Kevin clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. He had heard the way the doctor spoke to him, but it was the way he had spoken to Marcus that really set him off. It was clear to Kevin now that Dr. Howard was not just being dismissive. There was something else, something deeper going on. It wasn't just carelessness, it was something more personal. Kevin could feel the heat rising in his chest. He looked at his son, whose eyes were filled with confusion and fear. The doctor had refused to help them, and that only made Kevin more determined. He wasn't going to let this doctor get away with it, not when it was his son's health at stake. "I'm not leaving until you help my son," Kevin said, his voice low but steady. He could feel the anger building, but he knew he had to stay focused. This wasn't just about a doctor's refusal, it was about respect. It was about his son's future. Kevin's anger was rising with each passing second. He was used to keeping calm, but this was different. This wasn't just about his son's health. It was about how Dr. Howard had treated Marcus, how the doctor had brushed off his son's illness like it didn't matter. Kevin could feel his blood boiling, and he knew he couldn't just walk away without doing something. "I'm not going to sit here and let you ignore my son," Kevin said firmly, standing up from the chair. The doctor looked at him, slightly annoyed, but still uninterested. "Mr. Anderson, I've already told you. There's no reason to make a big deal out of this. Your son will be fine with a little rest. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other patients to attend to," Dr. Howard said, his voice dripping with arrogance. But Kevin wasn't about to back down. He turned to his son, who was still sitting on the examination table, looking exhausted and pale. Marcus looked up at him, eyes filled with fear and confusion. Kevin's heart broke at the sight of his son's distress, and that only fueled his determination. "No, I'm not leaving until you run the tests," Kevin said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I'm not going to risk my son's health just because you think it's not serious. Something's wrong." Dr. Howard rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by the insistence. "I've seen this 100 times before. Parents who think every little symptom is a sign of something more. Your son is fine." Kevin could feel his patience snapping. "What's your problem with him?" he demanded, stepping closer to the doctor. "Why are you treating him like this? You don't even care about his health." Dr. Howard froze, his face turning slightly red. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but instead he sneered. "You're making a scene over nothing. I'm trying to help, but you're being unreasonable." Kevin couldn't believe what he was hearing. The doctor wasn't just dismissing his son's symptoms. He was refusing to even listen. But there was something else, something that Kevin couldn't shake. It was the way the doctor had been looking at Marcus, like he was less important, like he didn't deserve proper care. Then, without warning, the young boy spoke, his voice weak but clear. "Dad, the doctor. He doesn't want to help because I'm not like the other kids," Marcus said, his words catching Kevin off guard. Kevin stared at his son in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, kneeling down in front of Marcus. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "He keeps looking at me like I'm not worth it, like I'm different." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Kevin's heart sank. It was now clear that Dr. Howard's treatment of Marcus wasn't just about the boy's health. It was about something deeper, something cruel. The doctor wasn't just being dismissive. He was treating Marcus differently because of who he was. Kevin's hands clenched into fists. His son had seen it too. The prejudice, the coldness in the doctor's eyes. Kevin had suspected it before, but now, hearing it from Marcus, it hit him like a punch to the gut. "Is that it?" Kevin asked, his voice cold. "You won't treat my son because you don't like him, because he's not like you." Dr. Howard's expression faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm not obligated to explain myself to you," he snapped. Kevin took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't just about a doctor's refusal anymore. This was about something far worse. Something that Kevin wasn't going to tolerate. He looked at his son, who was now sitting quietly, still unsure of what was going on, but trusting his father completely. Kevin made a decision then. He wasn't going to let this doctor get away with what he'd done. He had to protect Marcus, no matter what it took. Kevin stood in stunned silence for a moment, processing the words his son had just spoken. His heart ached for Marcus, who was sitting there, looking so small and vulnerable. How could anyone treat his son like this? How could a doctor, a person who was supposed to help, be so cruel? Dr. Howard seemed completely unfazed by the tension in the room. His hands were still on the clipboard, his posture stiff and businesslike. He seemed to be pretending like everything was normal, but Kevin knew it wasn't. Not anymore. With a deep breath, Kevin stood up and faced the doctor. "You don't get to treat my son like this," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You don't get to ignore his pain just because you don't like him." Dr. Howard looked up at him, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Anderson, I've already told you. I don't have time for this. Your son is fine, and I'm doing the best I can. You need to calm down." But Kevin wasn't calming down. Not now. Not when his son was sitting there in pain, needing help, and certainly not when Dr. Howard had shown such clear disrespect. "No," Kevin said firmly, stepping closer. "You need to listen. My son is not fine. He is not just some minor case you can brush aside. You don't get to treat people like this, and you certainly don't get to treat my son this way, just because you're too arrogant or prejudiced to care." The doctor's face turned slightly red. Kevin could tell he was trying to keep his temper in check, but it was clear that Kevin's words were getting under his skin. "You don't know anything about me or how I run my practice," Dr. Howard said, trying to sound in control, but his voice wavered just a bit. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Kevin replied, his voice steady and strong. "I'm telling you that I'm not leaving here without answers. I'm telling you that you will treat my son properly, or I'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, there was silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Kevin's words hung in the air, and Dr. Howard seemed to be deciding whether or not to back down. Kevin was ready for whatever came next. He had already made up his mind. No one was going to mistreat his son, not while he was standing right there. "You think you can just come in here and demand things," Dr. Howard said, his voice growing louder now. "I'm the doctor, not you. If you're so unhappy, you can leave, but you'll get no more treatment from me." Kevin's jaw tightened. He wasn't leaving without his son getting the proper care. "You'll wish you had treated us differently when this is over," he said, not raising his voice, but with enough force to make Dr. Howard understand how serious he was. The doctor glared at Kevin, clearly trying to decide if he should call security or just let things go. But before he could make a decision, Kevin turned and walked toward the door, glancing back at Marcus. "Come on, son," Kevin said softly, his voice now full of compassion. We're going somewhere else. You're getting treated today." Marcus stood up, his face full of confusion, but also a bit of relief. He followed his father out of the room, not saying a word, but his trust in Kevin was clear. The door to Dr. Howard's office closed behind them, but the tension inside hadn't gone away. Kevin knew this wasn't over. Kevin didn't say a word as he led Marcus out of the doctor's office and down the hallway. His mind was racing, filled with anger and frustration. He had never expected to face something like this, but now that he had, he wasn't about to let it slide. Marcus, who had been following his father quietly, looked up at him with concern. "Dad, what's going to happen now? Where are we going?" Kevin's heart softened as he looked at his son. The boy was still so young, and he didn't fully understand what had just happened. But Kevin could see the worry in his eyes, and it made him even more determined to fix this. "We're going to find another doctor," Kevin said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "One who will actually listen and take care of you." Marcus nodded slowly, though the uncertainty was still there. He trusted his father, but he could tell something was wrong. Kevin had never been this upset before. It was clear to Marcus that things had gone beyond just a simple visit to the doctor. His father was serious, and it wasn't just about finding another doctor. It was about something much bigger. They walked out of the building and into the parking lot. Kevin unlocked the car and helped Marcus into the front seat, trying to mask the deep frustration he felt. As he started the car, Kevin's mind was still on the doctor. He couldn't believe how that man had treated his son. There was no excuse for it. Not for the way Dr. Howard had dismissed Marcus' concerns, and certainly not for the way he had treated them both. But Kevin knew he couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let a person like that get away with what he'd done. The thought of how that doctor had looked at Marcus, the way he had dismissed him because of who he was, it made Kevin's blood boil. As he drove, Kevin thought about his options. He could file a complaint, sure, but was that enough? What would that actually change? He knew he had to do more. He had to make sure that Dr. Howard didn't get away with treating people this way again. Kevin's thoughts turned to action. He wasn't going to just sit back and hope for the best. He would make sure that Dr. Howard understood exactly what it meant to treat people with disrespect. His mind raced with ideas, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this doctor continue practicing without consequences. Kevin wasn't just going to fight for his son's health. He was going to fight for justice, and he would do whatever it took to make sure that this doctor would never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt Marcus. The drive to the new doctor's office was quiet, but Kevin's determination grew with each passing minute. He wasn't going to stop until he had made sure that Dr. Howard faced the consequences of his actions. He would do it for Marcus, and for anyone else who might suffer under that man's care in the future. When they arrived at the new office, Kevin helped Marcus out of the car. The boy looked up at him with a mix of confusion and relief. They walked inside, and Kevin knew that things were finally going to be okay. But the battle for justice was just beginning. Kevin and Marcus walked into the new doctor's office, a small but clean space that immediately felt different from the sterile, cold atmosphere of Dr. Howard's clinic. As they approached the reception desk, a kind woman greeted them with a warm smile, and it felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the icy reception they had just experienced. "Hello, how can I help you today?" the receptionist asked, her voice soft and welcoming. Kevin smiled back, grateful for the change. "We'd like to see the doctor, please. My son, Marcus, is feeling unwell, and we'd like a proper checkup." The receptionist nodded and immediately called for a nurse to take them to an exam room. Marcus followed his father, still a little nervous but comforted by the fact that they were no longer dealing with Dr. Howard. As the nurse led them to the exam room, Kevin's mind kept drifting back to the earlier events. The conversation with Dr. Howard, the doctor's cold attitude, and the terrible way he had treated Marcus. It all made Kevin feel sick to his stomach. He couldn't understand why someone in a position of trust would act that way. Kevin had been sure that he was in the right, but now he felt unsure. Was he overreacting? Was there a better way to handle it? But as he watched Marcus sit on the examination table, looking so fragile and small, Kevin knew the answer. There was no way he could have stayed quiet. No way he could have let the doctor treat his son that way, no matter what anyone else might think. The doctor, a gentle man with glasses and a calm voice, soon entered the room. He introduced himself with a smile and asked how Marcus was feeling. The difference was striking. This doctor didn't make assumptions. He listened to Kevin's concerns, asked thoughtful questions, and showed genuine care for Marcus' well-being. Kevin felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, someone who understood. "I'm glad we came here," Kevin said to the doctor, his voice quieter now that the stress had started to ease. "It's been a tough day." The doctor smiled kindly. "I understand. Let's take good care of your son today. We'll do a full exam and make sure everything is okay." As the doctor examined Marcus, Kevin's mind wandered again. He wondered about the next steps. Should he tell his friends and family about what had happened? Part of him felt that the situation with Dr. Howard had to be shared, that others needed to know. But then, another part of him hesitated. What would people think? Would they think he was being overly dramatic? Could this cause more trouble than it was worth? It was clear to Kevin that he wasn't the only one feeling uncertain. He had already discussed the situation briefly with a few close relatives, but their reactions had been mixed. Some had supported him, while others questioned whether it was worth making a big deal out of the incident. His sister, for example, felt that he should just move on. "Not every doctor is perfect," she'd said. "You've got to let it go." But Kevin couldn't just forget. This wasn't about being perfect. It was about fairness, respect, and doing what was right for his son. He had seen the way Dr. Howard had looked at Marcus, the way he had treated them both. Kevin knew he had to do something. As the doctor finished his examination, he gave Kevin some good news. Marcus' condition wasn't as serious as it had seemed at first. He had a mild virus, but nothing to be overly concerned about. Still, Kevin was relieved. At least now they had answers. When they left the office, Kevin felt a strange mix of emotions. He was glad that Marcus was going to be okay, but the thought of Dr. Howard's treatment still lingered in his mind. What would he do next? After leaving the new doctor's office, Kevin felt a small weight lift off his shoulders. Marcus was feeling better already, and the doctor's gentle care had helped him feel more at ease. It had been a tough day, but at least they now had answers. Kevin hoped that their visit to the new doctor would mark the end of the stressful situation. But something inside him told him this wasn't over yet. As they drove home, Kevin kept thinking about Dr. Howard. He couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about what had happened. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. How could someone in a position of authority be so callous and unkind? It wasn't just about Marcus. What if there were other children who had been treated the same way? What if this wasn't an isolated incident? Kevin felt a growing sense of urgency. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't let the doctor get away with what he'd done, not when it had such a lasting impact on his son. When they arrived home, Kevin sat down at the kitchen table, deep in thought. Marcus had gone to his room to rest, feeling better now that he had some medicine. Kevin tried to focus on the next steps. Should he file a formal complaint? Should he tell the local medical board? What if Dr. Howard wasn't the only one who acted this way? Suddenly, Kevin's phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. "Hello," he said, his voice cautious. "Mr. Anderson," a voice on the other end said. "This is Officer Reynolds from the police department. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Kevin's heart skipped a beat. What could this be about? "What's going on?" he asked, his voice now full of concern. "There's been an incident at the doctor's office," Officer Reynolds said. "We need you to come down here right away." Kevin's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the officer was saying. "What do you mean, an incident?" The officer's voice became more serious. We believe there was a situation involving Dr. Howard that could involve serious legal consequences. We need you to come in for a statement." Kevin's stomach twisted with worry. What had happened? Was this about the confrontation earlier in the day? Could it have gone that far? "I'll be right there," Kevin said, his voice shaking with confusion and anxiety. He hung up the phone and stood up quickly, his mind swirling with questions. He walked to Marcus' room and knocked gently on the door. "Marcus, I need to go out for a bit. You'll be okay here, right?" Marcus looked up from his bed, still tired but smiling slightly. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. Just go do what you need to do." Kevin gave him a quick hug, then rushed out the door, not knowing what he would face next. As he drove to the police station, his thoughts raced. What had happened at Dr. Howard's office? Could this really be the beginning of something bigger? When he arrived at the station, Officer Reynolds met him in the lobby. The officer's face was serious, and Kevin could tell this was something important. "We'll explain everything inside," the officer said, "but we need your help. We need to know exactly what happened today." Kevin nodded, feeling a mix of confusion and anticipation. Whatever was going on, he knew this wasn't just about his son anymore. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. Inside the police station, Kevin sat anxiously in a small, sterile room. The walls were bare, and the only sound was the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. Officer Reynolds had asked him to wait while they reviewed the details of the incident that had occurred earlier that day at Dr. Howard's office. Kevin's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. The police had sounded serious on the phone. But why? What had happened that was so urgent? Could it really be connected to the confrontation he'd had with Dr. Howard? He replayed the argument in his mind. He had simply stood up for Marcus. That's all. He had insisted that his son be treated fairly, and Dr. Howard had refused. There had been nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that should have led to a police involvement. Or so he thought. The door opened, and Officer Reynolds walked in, his expression serious. He motioned for Kevin to stand up. "Mr. Anderson," Officer Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm. "We've been reviewing the situation, and I need to explain what's going on." Kevin stood, feeling the weight of the moment. What's happening? What's this all about? The officer looked at him for a moment before speaking. "It turns out there's been more to today's events than you realized. After you left Dr. Howard's office, we received reports from several patients who were in the waiting room at the same time you were. They claimed they overheard Dr. Howard making some troubling comments about his refusal to treat your son." Kevin's heart sank. He had suspected that Dr. Howard was acting out of bias, but hearing it confirmed was another shock entirely. The officer continued. "A few of the patients in the waiting room took note of his words. Some of them felt uncomfortable, and others even filed complaints when they realized what was happening. We've started an investigation." Kevin was stunned. "You mean people heard what he said?" Officer Reynolds nodded. "Yes. We also found out that Dr. Howard has a history of complaints against him for similar behavior. He's been reported before, but no serious action has been taken until now. The evidence from today, along with the testimonies of the other patients, has raised serious concerns." Kevin felt a mixture of disbelief and relief. This wasn't just about him and Marcus anymore. This was about holding Dr. Howard accountable for his actions. He hadn't known what to expect when he left the doctor's office, but he never imagined this kind of outcome. "So what happens next?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Will he be held responsible?" "We're going to make sure this gets the attention it deserves," Officer Reynolds said. "We'll investigate further, and we'll make sure that if Dr. Howard's actions were as harmful as they seem, he will face the consequences." Kevin took a deep breath. He hadn't expected any of this. What had started as a simple visit to the doctor had spiraled into something much larger. But now, the truth was coming to light. Dr. Howard wasn't going to be able to get away with treating people this way any longer. As Kevin walked out of the police station, a sense of relief began to wash over him. He had done the right thing by standing up for Marcus. And now, people were starting to listen. The public was becoming aware of what had happened. The voices of those who had witnessed Dr. Howard's behavior were making an impact. Kevin smiled as he thought about Marcus. He had fought for his son, and the fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time that day, Kevin felt like he had truly done something important, something that could change things for the better. The next few days passed in a blur for Kevin. After his visit to the police station, things began to move quickly. News of Dr. Howard's actions spread across town, thanks to the patients who had witnessed the doctor's behavior and decided to speak up. Kevin had no idea how many people had been affected by the same kind of treatment, but now he was hearing about it from all sides. The media picked up the story, and soon, more people came forward, sharing their own experiences with Dr. Howard. What had started as one family's confrontation had turned into a full-scale public outcry. Kevin felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction that people were finally speaking out, but also a deep sadness that it had taken so long for anyone to listen. Kevin sat with Marcus one evening, talking to him about everything that had happened. Marcus had been a little confused at first about why the doctor's treatment had caused such a big reaction. He was young and didn't fully understand what had gone wrong, but he trusted his father completely. Kevin explained to him that sometimes people don't always treat others fairly, and it was important to stand up for what's right. "You did a good thing, Dad," Marcus said, his voice soft. "You made sure I was okay." Kevin smiled, feeling a sense of pride in his son's simple but wise words. "We both did the right thing, Marcus. We both fought for you." While things at home seemed to settle, Kevin couldn't ignore the bigger picture. The police continued their investigation, and Dr. Howard was placed on administrative leave while the medical board reviewed the complaints against him. Kevin had never imagined that standing up for his son would lead to such an investigation, but he was glad it was happening. He had no intention of backing down. It was about more than just one incident. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to face the same kind of treatment. One evening, Kevin received a letter from the local medical board. They had reviewed Dr. Howard's history, interviewed the witnesses, and examined the evidence. The board had decided to take disciplinary action. Dr. Howard's medical license would be temporarily suspended pending further review. Kevin was relieved. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a step in the right direction. Dr. Howard would have to answer for his actions. Kevin hoped that this would serve as a warning to other medical professionals about how important it was to treat everyone with respect. As the weeks went on, the public's awareness of the situation grew. People began to talk more openly about the ways in which bias could affect healthcare, and Kevin's story sparked conversations in many homes, schools, and workplaces. It felt like a change was starting, a shift toward fairness and justice. Kevin knew that the fight wasn't over and that there was still more to be done. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. His son was safe, healthy, and happy. And together, they had helped shine a light on something that needed to be addressed. That, Kevin realized, was worth more than anything. As he tucked Marcus into bed that night, he couldn't help but smile. They had done the right thing, and no matter what came next, they had made a difference.